The committees deployed funds to meet areas of critical needs like security, roads, water, health, education, and development of satellite towns within the territory, city maintenance and cleaning, agriculture and transportation, the construction of affordable housing and access road to the resettlement site of Wasa 1, construction of resettlement houses in Galui, Shere, rehabilitation and expansion of classrooms in FCT secondary schools. At this point, I would like to jump over to observations. Mr. President, my distinguished colleagues, you may wish to note that the overall performance of FCT 2019 statutory allocation was only 50%. The budget lasted for only a few months. Most of the projects executed by the FCDA were still ongoing due to overbearing ineptitude of getting the due process certificates on time. The committees further observed that new and ongoing projects were not sufficiently funded due to delay in release of funds occasioned by bureaucratic bottlenecks. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, for the year 2020, the proposed FCT budget is a total sum of 232,875,365,947 naira only, which is made up of, as stated, personnel costs of 53,876,241,095, overhead costs of 57,070,343,435, making a total recurrent expenditure of 110,946,584,530, and capital expenditure of 121,928,781,417, making a grand total of 232,875,365,947. This is the proposed 2020 FCT budget. However, in our recommendation, based on what I have already expatiated, in view of the aforementioned, the committees recommended the sum of 278,355,365,947 naira only as FCT statutory budget for 2020. From the projected revenue of 278,355,365,947 naira, the sum of 55,878,241,095 naira only is for personnel cost, while 62,343,723,435 naira only is for overhead costs, while the sum of 160,133,401,417 naira is for capital projects for the service of the Federal Capital Territory, Abuja, for the financial year commencing 1st January and ending 31st December 2020. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, in considering this budget, time is of essence due to the exigency of the work as the two committees, actually three committees of the Senate Committee on FCT and the House Committees of FCT and House Committee on Area Councils have harmonized the differences. On behalf of the committee, I hereby present the recommendation for consideration and passage into law. I so submit.
Any comments? Minority Whip.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, my name is distinguished Senator Philip Tanimo Aduda, FCT Senate. Mr. President, let me first congratulate the entire National Assembly for this show of patriotism and ensuring that the FCT appropriation bill is about to be passed into law. Mr. President, this is in keen into your vision for us to have a budget cycle of January to December, and as the Speaker of the State House of Assembly for the FCT, I want to say that you have done very well, and we have all done very well. Mr. President, having said that, the budget for the FCT Statutory Appropriation Act 2019 was passed in June, and I want to say, Mr. President, if the budget was passed in June, and today we have a performance of the 2019 budget as at 50-something%, I believe that they have done very well, and I believe that with the January to December budget cycle, the increase that have been done by the committee, I think is not really ambitious, because it will be achieved if within 5 months they were able to perform about 50-something%. So, Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, I've looked at the spread, and I think that the spread, the increase on infrastructural development, especially the satellite towns, because we need to really decongest the city center so that people can begin to own plots and even live in the satellite towns and come to work in the city center. Mr. President, I've also looked at the increase on health and engineering infrastructure. Mr. President, with these few remarks, I'd like to congratulate all of us and thank you, and hope and wish that we move straight into committee of the whole so that we can consider this budget and get it done with. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished colleagues, my name is Senator Joaquin Lure. I represent Ondo Central. I rise, Mr. President, to commend the Committee on FCT for the bold step they've taken to put the FCT IRRs into task to ensure that revenue potentials of FCT is achieved for the present year budget. I also want to commend them because there are potentials in FCT. Like I said, during the appropriation, when we were debating 2020 appropriation of the whole Nigeria, there are leakages in the system. And I want to commend them that the FCT IRS had the potential of achieving even the budget more than what it more than even 278 billion proposed to provide security architectures in the FCT. So I want to commend you, sir. I want to commend even the House too for being on the same page. And we also want to charge the FCT IRS that they should produce in the final analysis, when the actual is achieved, this budget should be able to be achieved 110%. If they are able to go on to ensure that revenue leakages are blocked and they are also deployed to provide infrastructure for FCT. Because all of us are residents of FCT, and we believe that the security increase in security provision to provide the security for FCT is also highly commended. Because this is the center of Nigeria. Anybody coming here must feel safe any time, any day. And again, the Senate of Ninth Assembly also charged the FCT IRS chairman that this 278 is too small and they should make it 300 billion. I so submit, Mr. President.
Senator Gabriel.
Mr. President, Dr. Gabriel Susuan, Benue Northeast. Mr. President, I want to commend the Committee on FCT and also the Minister, because if we compare this, what has happened at the level of the national budget, this is where you've seen that the expenditure on capital is far above that of the current expenditure. I think it's something that we must and have to commend the Minister of FCT and the committee for sustaining and making sure that for the first time we have a budget that clearly spelled out higher capital expenditure as against recurrent expenditure. Having said that, Mr. President, I also want to say that the Committee on FCT should be very critical in monitoring the expenditure on the capital. Because if we move around FCT, within the town, the central town, not at the marginals, you still have areas within the town where there is no infrastructure, whether it is street or even the other utilities. And these are, if you go to tackle, there are places where you don't have those utilities, roads, water, and even light. And so if they have this high capital expenditure, I think they should and must ensure that it is prudently spent on expenditure. Having said that, Mr. President, again, if we go to places like Karuanyanya, the last speaker alluded to the issues of enhanced security in FCT. Mr. President, those areas are where you have a lot of insecurity. On a daily basis, there are killings in those areas. And we seem to have concentrated more within FCT. If we do not attend to the security at the marginals of FCT, eventually, those people would have finished with every person there, and they will start closing in at the center of the Federal Capital Territory. And so we want to encourage the oversight function of the Committee on FCT to make sure that the issues of infrastructure within the central areas where there are no infrastructure, and then the issue of security at the marginals of the capital is well attended to. Otherwise, I think I want to support the minority whip that this House, this Senate should resolve into a committee of the whole in order to pass this budget. I so submit, Mr. President.
Senator Jibrin, but let me also advise, this is not second reading, and today is not our usual day. So please, I will appeal that we keep our contribution very short on the observation or comments on the report so that we're able to finish and leave in good time.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am Senator Jibrin, Kano North. Mr. President, mine is to commend the committee for having done a wonderful job. Despite the short period available to it. Something to commend about again is the fact that they've been able to harmonize their positions. The Senate committee and the two House committees, they've done a wonderful job, and they need to be commended. I think what we need to do is just to move ahead and immediately approve the report and get the bill passed, so that they can also key in, FCT can key into the January to December budget cycle. It's a welcome development. Congratulations, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you.
Leader of the Senate.
Mr. President, my highly respected and distinguished colleagues, I will rise to move the motion for the Senate to resolve in the Committee of Supply to consider this report.
Minority Leader.
Mr. President, I rise to second that the Senate resolve into a Committee of Supply in consideration of the FCT money bill. I so second.
Distinguished colleagues, those in favor that the Senate resolves into Committee of the Whole to consider the report of the Committee on FCT say aye. Those against say nay. The ayes have it. Distinguished colleagues, we will start the consideration of the report clause by clause, schedule by schedule, clause by clause. So we start from page 3 of the bill. Page 3. Now you have part A, recurrent schedule, part A, schedule part A, recurrent non-debt expenditure. Schedule part A, recurrent non-debt expenditure. Federal Capital Territory Administration, personnel costs, overhead costs, protocol department, personnel costs, overhead costs, security services department, personnel costs, overhead costs, treasury, personnel costs, overhead costs, Department of Economic Planning, personnel costs, overhead costs, FCT Establishment and Training Department, personnel costs, overhead costs, FCT Audit Department, personnel costs, overhead costs, Department of Monitoring and Inspection, personnel costs, overhead costs, Land Administration Department, personnel costs, overhead costs, FCT Procurement Department, personnel costs, overhead costs, FCT Directorate of Muslim Pilgrims Affairs, personnel costs, overhead costs, FCT Directorate of Christian Pilgrims Affairs, personnel costs, overhead costs, FCT Pension Department, personnel costs, overhead costs, FCT Archives and Historical Bureau, personnel costs, overhead costs, FCT Urban and Regional Planning Tribunal, personnel costs, overhead costs, Department of Outdoor Advertisement and Signages, personnel costs, overhead costs, Department of Information and Communication, personnel costs, overhead costs, FCDA Administration, personnel costs, overhead costs, Finance and Administration, personnel costs, overhead costs, Engineering Services, personnel costs, overhead costs, Public Building, personnel costs, overhead costs, Resettlement and Compensation Department, personnel costs, overhead costs, Urban and Regional Planning, personnel costs, overhead costs, Survey and Mapping, personnel costs, overhead costs, Mass Housing Department, personnel costs, overhead costs, FCDA Procurement Department, FCDA Procurement Department, personnel costs, overhead costs, FCDA Internal Audit, personnel costs, overhead costs, Public Relations, personnel costs, overhead costs, Engineering Design, personnel costs, overhead costs, FCT Legal Secretariat, personnel costs, overhead costs, Area Council Secretariat, personnel costs, overhead costs, ACSS Inspectorate Planning and Monitoring, personnel costs, overhead costs, ACSS Chieftaincy and Community Development, personnel costs, overhead costs, ACSS Primary Health Care Department, personnel costs, overhead costs, ACSS Planning, Research and Statistics, personnel costs, overhead costs, Area Council Service Commission, personnel costs, overhead costs, FCT Area Council Staff Pension Board, personnel costs, overhead costs, Office of the Auditor General for FCT Area Councils, personnel costs, overhead costs, Transport Secretariat, personnel costs, overhead costs, Road Traffic Services, personnel costs, overhead costs, Bus Rapid Transit and Transport Regulations, personnel costs, overhead costs, Department of Public Transportation, personnel costs, overhead costs, Department of Transportation, personnel costs, overhead costs, Education Secretariat, personnel costs, overhead costs. Agency for Mass Education, personnel costs, overhead costs. FCT Education Resource Center, personnel costs, overhead costs. FCT Universal Basic Education, personnel costs, overhead costs. FCT Secondary Education Board, personnel costs, overhead costs. FCT College of Education Zuba, personnel costs, overhead costs. FCT Agency for Science and Technology, personnel costs, overhead costs. FCT Scholarship Board, personnel costs, overhead costs. Department of Quality Assurance, personnel costs, overhead costs. Department of Higher Education, personnel costs, overhead costs. Department of Policy, Planning, Research and Statistics, personnel costs, overhead costs. Health and Human Services Secretariat, personnel costs, overhead costs. School of Nursing and Midwifery, personnel costs, overhead costs. Public Health Department, personnel costs, overhead costs. Health Planning, Research and Statistics Department, personnel costs, overhead costs. Department of Pharmacy, personnel costs, overhead costs. FCT Medical Diagnostics Department, personnel costs, overhead costs. Health Management Board, personnel costs, overhead costs. Primary Health Care Development Board, personnel costs, overhead costs. Agricultural Rural Development Secretariat, personnel costs, overhead costs. FCT Agri Development Project, personnel costs, overhead costs. Department of Agri Services, personnel costs, overhead costs. Department of Agricultural Planning, Research and Statistics, personnel costs, overhead costs. Department of Veterinary Services, personnel costs, overhead costs. Department of Animal Production, personnel costs, overhead costs. Department of Forestry and Rural Development, personnel costs, overhead costs. Social Development Secretariat, personnel costs, overhead costs. Welfare Department, personnel costs, overhead costs. Sports Department, personnel costs, overhead costs. Tourism Department, personnel costs, overhead costs. Gender Development Department, personnel costs, overhead costs. Arts and Culture, personnel costs, overhead costs. Youth Department, personnel costs, overhead costs. Abuja Metropolitan Management Council, personnel costs, overhead costs. Parks and Recreation, personnel costs, overhead costs. Facilities Maintenance and Management, personnel costs, overhead costs. FCT Urban Affairs, personnel costs, overhead costs. Development Control Department, personnel costs, overhead costs. FCT Water Board, personnel costs, overhead costs. Abuja Environmental Protection Board, personnel costs, overhead costs. Abuja Geographic Information Systems, personnel costs, overhead costs. Satellite Towns Development Department, personnel costs, overhead costs. Abuja Infrastructure Investment Center, personnel costs, overhead costs. FCT Emergency Management Agency, personnel costs, overhead costs. Department of Fire Service, personnel costs, overhead costs. The general summary is total personnel, total overhead. The total recurrent is 118,221,964,530 naira. Those in favor that this stands part of the schedule say aye. Those against say nay. The ayes have it. Part B, capital expenditure. Federal Capital Territory Administration, Protocol Department, Security Services Department, FCT Treasury, Department of Economic Planning, Department of Human Resource Management, FCT Audit Department, Department of Monitoring and Inspection, Land Administration Department, FCT Procurement Department, FCT Directorate of Muslim Pilgrims Affairs, FCT Directorate of Christian Pilgrims Affairs, FCT Pension Department, FCT Archives and Historical Bureau, FCT Urban and Regional Planning Tribunal, Department of Outdoor Advertisement and Signages, Department of Information and Communication, FCDA Administration, Finance and Administration, Engineering Services, Public Buildings, Resettlement and Compensation Department, Urban and Regional Planning, Survey and Mapping, Mass Housing Department, FCDA Procurement Department, Internal Audit, Public Relations, Engineering Design, FCT Legal Secretariat, Area Council Secretariat, ACSS Inspectorate Planning and Monitoring, ACSS Chieftaincy and Community Development, ACSS Primary Health Care Department, ACSS Planning, Research and Statistics, Area Council Service Commission, FCT Area Council Staff Pension Board, Office of the Auditor General for FCT Area Councils, Transport Secretariat, Road Traffic Services, Bus Rapid Transit and Transport Regulations, Department of Traffic Management, Department of Transportation, Education Secretariat, Agency for Mass Education, FCT Education Resource Center, FCT Universal Basic Education, FCT Secondary Education Board, FCT College Education Zuba, FCT Agency for Science and Technology, FCT Scholarship Board, Department of Policy Implementation, Department of Higher Education, Department of Policy Planning, Research and Statistics, HHS Secretariat, School of Nursing and Midwifery, Public Health Department, Health Planning, Research and Statistics, Department of Pharmacy, FCT Medical and Diagnostics, Health Management Board, Primary Health Care Development Board, Agriculture and Rural Development Secretariat, FCT Agri Development Project, Department of Agricultural Services, Department of Agricultural Planning, Research and Statistics, Department of Veterinary Services, Department of Animal Production, Department of Forestry and Rural Development, Social Development Secretariat, Welfare Department, Sports Department, Tourism Department, Gender Development Department, Arts and Culture, Youth Department, Abuja Metropolitan Management Council, Parks and Recreation, Facilities Maintenance and Management, FCT Urban Affairs, Development Control Department, FCT Water Board, Abuja Environmental Protection Board, Abuja Geographic Information Systems, Satellite Towns Development Department, Abuja Infrastructure Investment Center, FCT Emergency Management Agency, Department of Fire Service. The total capital is 160,133,401,417 naira only. Those in favor that this stands part of the bill say aye. Those against say nay. The ayes have it. The grand total recurrent and capital is 278,355,365,947 naira only. Those in favor that this stands part of the schedule say aye. Those against say nay. The ayes have it. We'll go to the clauses. Clauses on page 2. Page 2. Those in favor that clause 1 stands part of the bill say aye. Those against say nay. The ayes have it. Those in favor that clause 2 stands part of the bill say aye. Those against say nay. The ayes have it. Those in favor that clause 3 stands part of the bill say aye. Those against say nay. The ayes have it. Those in favor that clause 4 stands part of the bill say aye. Those against say nay. The ayes have it. Those in favor that the clause 5 stands part of the bill say aye. Those against say nay. The ayes have it. Those in favor that clause 6 stands part of the bill say aye. Those against say nay. The ayes have it. Those in favor that clause 7 stands part of the bill say the short title. Those in favor that the explanatory memorandum, which is on page 12, please. Page 12. Page 12. Those in favor that the explanatory memorandum stands part of the bill say aye. Those against say nay. The ayes have it. We'll go to page 7. No, page 3, sorry. Page 3, where the short title is, and that's item 7. Those in favor that the short title stands part of the bill, say aye. Those against, say nay. The ayes have it. The long title, which is also is on page 2. The long title is on page 2. Those in favor that the long title stands part of the bill, say aye. Those against, say nay. The ayes have it. Leader of the Senate.
Mr. President, my highly respected and distinguished colleagues, I move that the chairman assume chair as president of the Senate on plenary to report progress. I so move.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, I rise to second the motion that the Senate do now move into plenary to report progress. I so second.
Those in favor that the Senate reverse the plenary for the chair to report progress, say aye. Those against, say nay. The ayes have it. Distinguished colleagues, the Senate and the Committee of Supply considered the report of the Committee on Federal Capital Territory (FCT) on the 2020 Appropriation Bill 2019 and approved as follows. Schedule as recommended, Schedule Part A as recommended, Schedule Part B as recommended, Clauses 1 to 7 as recommended, the short title as recommended, long title as recommended. Is this a true reflection of what transpired in the Committee of the Whole? Thank you. Leader of the Senate.
Mr. President, my highly respected and distinguished colleagues, I move that the 2020 FCT Appropriation Bill 2019 be now read the third time. I so move.
Minority Leader.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, I rise to second the motion that this FCT Appropriation 2020 be now read a third time. I so second.
Distinguished colleagues, those in favor that the bill be now read the third time, say aye. Those against, say nay. The ayes have it. Clerk of the Senate.
Mr. President, distinguished senators, a bill for an act to authorize the issue from the Federal Capital Territory Administration Statutory Revenue Fund or the Federal Capital Territory Administration account, the total sum of 278,355,365,947 naira only, of which the sum of 55,878,241,075 naira only is for personnel costs, and the sum of 62,343,723,435 naira only is for overhead costs, while the balance of 160,133,401,470 naira only is for capital projects for the service of the Federal Capital Territory, Abuja, for the financial year commencing from 1st January and ending on the 31st December 2020, third reading.
A bill for an act to authorize the issue from the Federal Capital Territory Administration Statutory Revenue Fund or the Federal Capital Territory Administration account, the total sum of 278,355,365,947 naira only, of which the sum of 55,878,241,075 241,095 naira only is for personnel costs, and the sum of 62,343,723,435 naira only is for overhead costs, while the balance of 160,133,401,417 naira only is for capital projects for the service of the Federal Capital Territory, Abuja, for the financial year commencing from 1st January and ending on 31st December 2020. Third reading taken and passed. Distinguished colleagues, let me thank the Senate Committee on FCT, like our previous speakers did. The committee, like it is the character of this Senate, worked day and night to get this report put together. This report, like we know, should have been taken yesterday, but because of the sad event of the death of our colleague, we couldn't take it yesterday. For the Senate to reconvene today, Friday, which is not a sitting day by our standing orders, shows the commitment, dedication, the capacity of the Senate to stand to deal with any matter that is of national significance and national interest. So I want to congratulate the entire Senate and indeed the National Assembly, because the House of Reps is also supposed to be doing the same. This is to show that we are interested very, very much in any issue that will make life better for Nigerians. As the State Assembly of the FCT, we have discharged our responsibility. The next thing is for FCT to ensure that it implements the budget. So I will, on behalf of all of us, urge the FCT committee to be steadfast to ensure that what we have passed here is what is implemented. We will work together with the executive arm of government to ensure that we get those revenues that are supposed to fund the budget that we have passed. So I believe that in this regard, we will not allow the FCT administration not to do what is expected of it. We must ensure that this FCT is reclaimed, because there are so many things that are not going right. We need to ensure that this FCT is safe, that residents and visitors alike come in here, do their businesses safely in a very secured environment. This is supposed to be the most secured city in Nigeria, because this is the seat of government. And if we are not able to provide that security that is befitting of the status of the FCT, the story outside of Nigeria will not be good for Nigeria. So I believe that we have done our job, and what is left is for FCT to take up its responsibility, and for our committee on FCT to ensure that this budget is implemented. But let me also commend the FCT minister and his team for ensuring that this budget proposal in the first place was put together and was brought to the National Assembly. In the previous years, maybe it will be June or July before this kind of budget estimates will come. But I think both the legislature in the 9th Assembly and the executive are in the mood to change the way things were. And I believe that Nigerians will continue to support all of us here for doing what we are doing, and of course show understanding like they have always done, and continue to also suggest ways that we can achieve better outcomes. Finally, on a very general note, let me thank my distinguished colleagues. Since we took our oath of office here on the 11th of June, it has been work. And it has been unity, focus, and understanding between and amongst us individually, and of course, even as political party adherents. I believe that we have done so well in the last 6 months. I had a press engagement last week, and I tried to inform Nigerians what we have been able to do in the last 6 months. We couldn't have done all those things without the unity that we found amongst ourselves. We are human beings. We will have our own weaknesses, but we have shown and demonstrated clearly that we can accommodate each other, we can accommodate ourselves with whatever inadequacies we may find in or among ourselves. But one thing stands out clear, that this 9th Senate is prepared to change Nigeria for the better. For passing the budget 2020 before the end of December, and for the President to sign the budget 2020 before the end of December, and for the budget 2020 to start taking effect from 1st January, definitely the Nigerian economy will see significant changes, because the inflow or the disbursements of funds by government will be an injection of some resources into the economy. That was something that was not available previously. We believe that the executive has a role here to ensure that the budget 2020 is implemented fully, as much as our resources can accommodate. But we also have a responsibility to ensure that we continue to talk, evaluate the revenues or revenue generating agencies, ensure that the revenues come in, and every available provision in the budget should be treated equally, because this document is a law. And oversight, yes, it is probably the most important thing that we have to do to ensure the budget 2020 is implemented for the benefit of Nigerians. So we will take a special way of dealing with oversight. We are going to oversight fully. All our committees will carry out their oversight fully on the executive arm of government. We believe that this is not trying to make someone uncomfortable. This is the best way to go to ensure that there is the implementation of those laudable and noble projects that will make life better for Nigerians. So we should be prepared when we come back. But also when we come back, by the grace of God, we are going to face some of the very serious legislations that are required in Nigeria. First, the PIB. The Petroleum Industry Bill has defied solution since 2007, when the executive brought in the Petroleum Industry Bill, and it couldn't pass. In 2011, the executive brought it again, it couldn't pass. In 2015, the legislature took it up in a solo fashion, it couldn't pass. Now, we have to act differently. The executive and the legislature will work very closely on this and come up with a legislation on the PIB that will be in the interest of Nigeria, but also protect the investments that are here and even encourage more investment to come in. So we are going to deal with that. We are also going to look into the issue of constitution amendment. There are so many issues that today require the attention of the legislature, the National Assembly, particularly in the amendment of the constitution to make governance better. But we also have to do a lot on the electoral reform. Every election gives us an opportunity to see the strengths and weaknesses of our laws, the electoral laws. There are so many lessons that we have learned from the general elections of 2019, but also the standalone elections in Kogi, Belsa, and other places. So this is also going to engage, we are going to engage in that, and I believe that we have learned a lot of lessons from the previous exercises. It is also of interest that Nigerians who feel strongly about any issue should come to the National Assembly instead of staying somewhere to complain. Because the National Assembly is here and is available for people to come with their bills, and of course, if they have suggestions or ideas on how to make the electoral process better and sanitized. Finally, I want to once again, on behalf of the leadership of the Senate, thank all our distinguished colleagues here for giving us the kind of support that was needed. Nothing could have been achieved here without the support of the distinguished senators. Nothing. No matter how lofty an idea is, until everybody willingly buys in. And we have gotten a buy-in of all of our colleagues, and we are doing this for the benefit of our country. Thank you very much. Leader of the Senate.
Thank you, Mr. President. My highly respected and distinguished colleagues, having concluded today's proceedings on the order paper, I hereby move that the Senate do adjourn until later in the day at 12:30 a.m. I so move. 11:30 a.m. 11:30.
Leader, you should be able to tell us why we are coming back at 11:30. Is it for votes and proceedings to be passed, right? For the votes and proceedings of today. Okay. Senate Minority Leader.
Yes, Mr. President, very distinguished colleagues, I rise to second the motion that the Senate do stand adjourned for 30 minutes to enable...
It's 15 minutes.
To enable production of the vote and proceedings. I so second.
Distinguished colleagues, those in favor that the Senate do adjourn for 15 minutes to come back in 11:30 in order to take the votes and proceedings of today. Those in favor say aye. Those against say nay. The ayes have it. The Senate is hereby adjourned till 11:30 a.m.